All right, so we'd like to welcome Sanah Ahmed, an undergrad at Cornell University and a member of the Muslim Mental Health Lab at Stanford. Without further ado, we give the floor to Sanah Ahmed. You have 20 minutes. Q&A. We request that our online attendees type their questions in the chat box and we'll get to it at the end. Our in-person attendees, if you could write down your questions on this card paper, we'll address them at the end as well. Thank you.
So, Assalamualaikum. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanatan wa fil akhirati hasanatan wa qina adhaban nar. Assalamualaikum. Today I will be presenting my research on the impacts of trauma on environmental behaviors. Before I jump in, I would like to introduce myself really quickly. My name is Sanah Ahmed and I'm a junior studying psychology at Cornell. I conducted this research through an environmental sustainability lab at my university. And currently I work as a research intern at Stanford's Muslim Mental Health Lab. I am grateful to be part of the conference, even though I'm virtual. All right, let's go ahead. So during this presentation, I will be discussing the Syrian war, violence, and trauma, among other topics. So if at any point you feel uncomfortable, please feel free to step away if needed. So here's my outline of the presentation. I will be discussing the background, key terms, survey design, data and analysis, results, and lastly, the implications of this study. The research that I am presenting right now focuses on the role and the impact trauma plays on your environmental behaviors. I was very curious to understand how witnessing the environmental damage can influence future behaviors long-term. So these next few slides are going to be introducing some key terms that I'll be using throughout the presentation. The first is trauma, which is an emotional response to a disturbing event. And there are three types of trauma. The first is acute, which results from a single distressing event. The second is chronic trauma, which occurs when a person is exposed to a traumatic event for an extended amount of time. And the participants of my research are Syrian refugees, and they've experienced trauma long-term from the Syrian war, so they would fall into the chronic category. And complex trauma is exposure to multiple varied events throughout their lifetime. Perceived danger is a person's subjective view on threats and hazards in their daily life. So if you were to determine someone's perceived danger, you would ask them questions such as how likely they are to hear bombs, to be wounded, or be killed. Perceived danger has been known to be associated with PTSD. So for the sake of my research, I'm going to be using perceived danger to determine the relative amount of trauma that a person experiences. So for example, if a person experiences a high level of perceived danger, I would be associating this with a greater amount of trauma. Right, so environmental behaviors are a person's environmental values, beliefs, norms, and attitudes that can change the resources or energy from an environment. Here are some of the consequences of the Syrian war on civilians. So the Syrian war began in 2011 as a civil uprising and it escalated to an armed conflict. It led to 400,000 Syrians losing their lives. About 90% of the population lived below the poverty line, and 13.5 million refugees have been displaced from Syria. There are also environmental consequences of the Syrian war. There are high levels of air pollution. Only about 50% of water and sanitation systems function properly across Syria. There is soil and vegetation degradation, and as a result, about 60% of the Syrian population suffer from food insecurity. And lastly, there is 1/3 damaged or destroyed housing, which includes half of medical and educational facilities. So the purpose of my research was to determine the implications war trauma has on environmental behaviors. So to conduct this survey, I designed the survey and I translated it into Arabic and I sent it to a refugee center named Homes League Abroad in Amman, Jordan. And the refugees at this center have been displaced due to the Syrian war. So I conducted the survey on Qualtrics and I sent it over, and then I analyzed it using SPSS. So respondents answered questions about their perceived danger, environmental knowledge, and environmental behavior, taking the position of when they were living in Syria. And then I would ask these same questions, trying to understand their current viewpoint while living at the refugee center. All of the questions were framed in a Likert scale sort of format. So I was able to give each answer a score of 1 through 5. A 5 would indicate that a person exhibits higher levels of trauma, but also a greater amount of environmental behaviors. So here are 2 examples of the questions that I asked in my survey. The first is, when I lived in Syria, environmental pollution affected my health. Then I would ask them to reflect on their beliefs today and ask, today, I believe environmental pollution affects my health. So here's a compilation of all of the questions that I asked. I can go back to it if anyone has any questions. So survey sensitivity was extremely crucial when designing this survey because I was asking people in Jordan and not in the US. So certain topics which may be problematic in one area may not be in another. So I needed to create my survey accordingly based on these cultural differences. My number 1 priority was to frame the survey questions in such a way to prevent any triggering feelings of trauma that could arise for these refugees. And reflecting on it, one question that came up when creating the survey is that, how do I know that these participants know what I'm referring to when I talk about environmental behaviors or attitudes? And so to mitigate this problem, I had my survey reviewed by my Arabic professor who lives in Jordan and psychologists who have experience working with Syrian refugees. So in particular, many of the psychologists that I asked to revise my survey actually had experience working with the refugees that I was surveying in Jordan. So for example, instead of saying, I am afraid of encountering an explosion or a bomb, the statement was changed to, I am afraid of encountering an explosion, to avoid asking the same thing twice unnecessarily. In the gender options, I removed the non-binary option and I kept the options either as male, female, or other. And in the environmental behavior questions, I modified this to relate to the refugees. For example, refugees likely are not worrying about whether they need to be purchasing more expensive food items to benefit the environment. So I had to change the survey accordingly to that. Great, so now for the fun demographics. I surveyed 24 respondents and 100% of them were female. And this is because majority of the people living at the center are widows. And the average respondent age is between 35 through 44 years old. The mean respondents lived at the center for 3 to 4 years. And what was surprising to see was that many of these refugees have only received elementary school education, despite being about 35 through 44 years old. So to analyze my data, I used Pearson correlations to determine if there was a statistically significant relationship between the variables that are listed on the screen, which are age, education, years living at the center, and perceived trauma and environmental behaviors. So here is a closer look into the Pearson correlations. These are all of the variables that are significant at the 0.05 correlation level. A negative number illustrates that there is an inverse relationship between the two variables. So as you can see in the red, the negative 0.443 indicates that there seems to be inverse relationship between age and environmental behaviors now. We see the same thing with education and environmental behaviors. So the younger that you are, or the less educated you are, you may exhibit more environmentally friendly behaviors. This 0.482 number indicates that a greater level of trauma may be associated with more education, which I would love to delve into further in the future. The second analysis that I did is a hierarchical multiple regression factor, and I removed some variables such as age and education in different models to determine if these variables were efficient at predicting environmental behaviors in the long run. In the first model, I have all 4 variables. In the second, I remove age. And in the third, I remove education. So what does this mean exactly? This model is a summary of all of the variables that were removed to see how statistically significant they were. And as you can see with the red arrow, the change from model 1 to model 2 when we removed age is not significant because there is an increase in significant factor change. Versus in model 2 to model 3, there is a decrease when we remove education, which indicates that education may be statistically significant at predicting environmentally friendly behavior in the long run. And here is a look at the model 3 coefficients. As you may remember, the model 3 removes age and removes education. So now we're just looking at perceived danger now versus in Syria. And you can see that in both instances, there is a negative number, which indicates that there's an inverse relationship between the trauma that you feel and your environmental behaviors. Okay, so what were my results? The education is negatively correlated with environmentally friendly behaviors in this study, and respondents who score higher in perceived danger or have higher levels of trauma may be less willing to exhibit pro-environmentally friendly behavior. So here are some possible reasonings of why we see these results. The first may be that witnessing the destruction of your home can trigger an adverse response in someone, and they may be less willing to exhibit pro-environmentally friendly behaviors. Some other factors could be cultural norms or the role of religion in environmentally friendly behaviors. And an alternate reason may be the hierarchy of needs, which I will go into further in the next slide. So the hierarchy of needs is a motivational theory, and it's the idea that the needs that are lower down in the hierarchy need to be satisfied before individuals can attend to the needs that are higher up on the hierarchy. But I would like to point out that Ibn Sina was actually the first person to propose a hierarchy of motivational powers. He created this theory 900 years before Maslow, and he focused on the physical, cognitive, and virtuous aspects that can motivate a person. But I will go through some of these hierarchies very briefly. The first is physiological needs, safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, and lastly, self-actualization. Environmentally friendly actions would probably fit best on the self-actualization scale. So using this theory, someone who experiences a greater level of trauma perhaps may be less willing to help the environment until they're able to satisfy their basic needs, such as food security and living and safety needs. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbates this issue. The pandemic for refugees has held traumatic reminders that they may be unable to control the situation, similar to feelings that they've experienced during the war. It's important to bring out some of the limitations of my study. My study was done with limited participants, a participant pool from one refugee center, and I was only able to survey female participants. but replicating the study will reduce the variability within my data. So further research, without satisfying some of your basic needs, such as housing and living, someone who experiences trauma may possibly have difficulty actively helping the environment. And this highlights the need to destigmatize mental health issues and also increase care for those with trauma. There is research on the power of religion on environmental behaviors despite one's circumstances. And one potential avenue for intervention that I have not looked at yet is maybe people who are aware of these ayahs and hadiths discussing the importance of caring for the environment, despite all of the trauma and challenges that they may have faced. They may not litter and they may be more environmentally friendly because of the moral obligation that they hold strongly. So this illustrates that even with perceived trauma, there is still hope for a group like this to increase their pro-environmentally friendly behaviors if they are aware of some of the spiritual and ayahs and like sunnahs of the Prophet that illustrate that you should take care of the environment. Okay, so that concludes the presentation. As a result, we have learned that it's important to level the playing field and get basic necessities addressed for all human beings in order to truly make a difference in the environment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and Jazakallah khair. That was really poignant and really heart-wrenching. And I'm sure all of us have a lot of questions. I just want to reiterate that our online attendees can drop their questions in the chat box, and we'll get to it towards the end. In-person attendees, if you have any questions, let me know. We can write them down, and we'll hit them towards the end of the session as well. Yeah, I have a lot of questions myself. But before we do that, I'd like to move on. So we have with us now, is it Dr. Yusif or just Yusif? Soon to be Dr. Yusif.
Yes,
all right, Yusif, can you share your screen?
yes.
All right. All right, so just a brief intro. So Yusif Salaam Conn is a research intern at the Stanford Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab. He graduated from Zaytuna College in 2021 with a BA in Liberal Arts and Islamic Studies, along with the completion of a pre-med track at Berkeley. Yusif's research is centered around the analysis of historical Arabic medical texts and translation, including the texts of Abu Bakr al-Razi and Ibn Sina. So yeah, Yusif, you have the stage.
All right, is my presentation up? All right, alhamdulillah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Thank you everybody for coming, those in person and those who joined us online, and thank you to the organizers of this event for allowing me to join virtually from Oakland, California. Today I'm going to be presenting a paper that was worked on by a team from our lab at Stanford on religion, faith, and psychology during pandemics, evidence from Muslim histories of plague. Before we begin, there's no disclosures that our team has, no conflicts of interest or funding to report. And we invite you all to visit our lab page, the Stanford Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab, to learn more about what we do and the efforts that Dr. Rania and her team are going into to help, inshallah, further Muslim mental health and Islamic psychology in the West. So as I stated, the title of our paper is Religion, Faith, and Psychology During Pandemics, Evidence from Muslim Histories of Plague, presenting at the 14th Annual Muslim Mental Health Conference. The authors of this paper are Dr. Rania Awad, Marwa Nursoy, and Abdullah Khalil, and Hussam Hilal. And I served as an editor and contributor to this paper. So the background for this paper is looking at, in terms of how this can benefit clinicians and Muslim mental health professionals, is looking at how we form long-term coping systems for in a pandemic. As all the psychological traumas and difficulties come to one during a pandemic, what are the different ways in which one has coping systems in meaning-making that gets one through this experience? And so in this paper, we looked at historical examples. We looked at the role of religion in coping in terms of scripture, as well as looking at the frameworks that individuals and groups made that have been recorded throughout history. So looking at the historical context, this is not the first time Muslims have faced a pandemic. We're facing one now across the world with the coronavirus, but throughout history, many times the Muslim empires, Muslim communities, whether majority or minority, have had to deal with pandemics and plagues and the like. And so because of that, we have a rich tradition of literature, both in terms of the hadith and the Quran, which we can see as the scriptural accounts of dealing with plague, as there are many examples within both that give divine injunctions on how to respond to these types of difficulties, whether specifically dealing with plague and illness or generally dealing with hardship, as well as historical accounts. We can see how Muslims throughout history, how they built their responses, how they were able to cope. And this information offers a vast amount of resources for us to look at when dealing with clients and patients who are having difficulties or looking for ways to make meaning out of this. And so this term is one of the main things that we're looking at as we're going through the historical accounts and as we're going through the scripture and looking at traditionally, how did the Muslims of the past make meaning out of their circumstance? So when we're saying meaning making, we're referring to how belief systems guide individuals in the process of making this meaning out of the situation. They're establishing mental representation of possible relationships among things, events, and other relationships. And then another way that we can define it is the restoration of meaning in the context of highly stressful situations. So yes, so looking at these highly stressful situations and how we are able to understand, why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to us? Especially from a religious standpoint, for people who are practicing Muslims, why is it happening that we're facing difficulty, and what should we be getting out of it? And that's where we find the convergence of both scripture and cultural context. What is the cultural context of what we're dealing with? What is the scriptural context of what we're dealing with? And where those converge, that is where we are located, and we have to make meaning of our situation. So looking at some of the scripture that guides this way, both historically, when we're looking at the chroniclers of history, because unlike today where history is looked at as a secular science, in the Islamic empires, history was very much done by those who specifically majored in the study of hadith, the study of prophetic traditions. And so the chroniclers of hadith, people like Ibn Asakir, Ibn Kathir, these are big names in religious sciences, but they're also the main sources for historical accounts of how the plagues were dealt with. And so they very much are looking at the situation, not just trying to record the details of what is going on at the time, which they do in great extent in the original languages that they wrote their texts in, but they're also looking at it as writing an explanation from a religious perspective of why this is happening. And so one specific verse from the Quran that forms the foundation for a lot of how they're viewing this is from the chapter of the Quran 13, verse number 11. Verily, Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. So they see what's going on as a reminder of looking inward. So at this time where people are dealing with fear, anxiety, grief, and loss, the chroniclers are going to look at, what does this mean internally for each individual? So in the parallels, we see that during this time, that whereas today, we have online access to looking at the ways that, we see within a few days or even within a few hours, we get news of something online. Back then, news came very sporadically. We see records of when a traveler would come from a faraway land and bring news of plague, how that would influence the people of that town, of that city, that they didn't know that a plague had already broken out. Perhaps a lot of times people had family in another village or another city, and then they would hear only weeks afterwards that a plague had broken out. So because of this, we see how information plays a very pivotal role in the way that people in history were dealing with grief and anxiety and fear, that they did not have access to secure information in the way that we do today. And that increased the amount of anxiety and fear in some ways, but perhaps in others, it also meant that they didn't have the anxiety of knowing everything when it comes up. And so this fear that was being generated as plagues became prevalent in the different ways that they came throughout Islamic history, we see that in some, it drove them to superstition, that they did not think about the divine wisdom. The chroniclers detail this very clearly, that people went to superstitious acts, they went to soothsayers, they went to magic and these different things that are frowned upon by their religion, by Islam as a whole, and no sect agreed with, but people still went to them because this fear drove them to find whatever was the easiest access thing that they could get to that gave them a sense of security. And on the other hand, others, they faced what was a very dangerous circumstance. They saw that something was coming to them that they did not have control over. They did not have an understanding of plagues and pandemics and illness like we do today, where we can understand to the same extent how to prevent illness from coming. So they see this as something that is just, if it comes to them, it comes to them, and they will most likely die from it. And so we see, for example, Ibn al-Wardi, one of the poets and chroniclers of history, that he became sick with a plague, with the pandemic of 1349 Common Era in Syria. And so he writes down, as he's coming to his death, he keeps writing his poems describing his state. And he says, "Unlike others, I do not fear the pandemic, for it affords me two possible outcomes, each better than the other. If I die, then I find rest away from the contagions of this world. If I live, I get to witness more of the world through the healing of my ears and eyes." And so this is now two very different views of we see throughout history, that a lot of people are abandoning religion because they are not content with God, if it is God's wisdom that they die in this plague. They see this as a very detrimental thing to them. They need to run away from it. And so they go to whatever other means that they have. And again, a reminder that this is not a time where, medicine and things like that are able to prevent a plague. And we see today, it's still not able to prevent a plague or a pandemic. So even more so at this time, people are running to whatever they can find. Whereas others are facing this and they're able to see it head on, and they find the best out of it. They think about what their religion means in terms of what it would mean if they die, and if they go to heaven because they died in a plague and it was a test from God. Excuse me. Another poetic description that became very common during the plague of Emmaus in the 12th century comes from the Ibn Asakir, one of the chroniclers. And so he wrote, "How many brave horsemen and how many beautiful chaste women were killed in the valley of Amwas. They had encountered the Lord, but he was not unjust to them. When they died, they were among the non-aggrieved people in paradise. We endure the plague as the Lord knows, and we were consoled in the hour of death." And so we see again that this is a case of people facing death head on, and they're able to accept it because they see the good that their religion gives them comfort in, the meaning that religion provides in the face of something that does not have an apparent meaning. And another thing that we see very much so, because this is something that there is contention over, is to whether or not, to what extent quarantine existed. And we see different historical accounts, cases where people understood quarantine and they would lock themselves in private rooms away from everybody when they heard of a plague. But either way, whether people faced isolation and loneliness from a standpoint of their neighbors and their families were dying and their communities were falling apart, or because they're quarantining away from everyone, they were facing this loneliness and this isolation. And we see, again, not far away from the last plague that we looked at, that Ibn Ata'illah al-Iskandari says, "When God isolates you from his creation, know that he wants to open the door of intimacy with him to you." Again, another way of how the scholars and the chroniclers are finding ways of making meaning out of the situation in order to give people some hope and relief and a psychological break from everything that's going on around them. And instead of being caught in that fear and anxiety, to go into a state of appreciation and hope. So now we'll look at the importance of community. Like I just said, communities are falling apart. We see this prevalently throughout the chroniclers. There's records of whole villages that had to be buried. The whole, all of the houses were razed and just buried because the people in the houses had died, and nobody would go into the houses to bury the bodies out of fear of catching the plague themselves. And so, but because there is a high level of emphasis that Islam puts on sincerity and the integrity of communities, that people still found ways to maintain this aspect of community, this connection, despite what was happening. And so we see this, that throughout the different plagues, specifically we looked at the Mamluk, in the Mamluk dynasty, the records that scholars had of the plagues and how communities reacted. We see that many people actually, they begin to volunteer to do burials for people that pass away. That people are, because the price of burials skyrocketed, as people don't want to have to deal with burying bodies, as land became used up for graves, and as the morticianers are now dying themselves from burying, that we see people begin to volunteer to do this. People who've lost their families, people who are have accepted that this may be their fate, they are burying the corpses of others. And remember, this is whole villages, this is whole families that have passed away, and there's no other family member to bury your neighbor, that neighbors are coming and burying them. We see evidence of, both on local community levels and across whole states of empires, we see that whether it's imams or political leaders, they're giving reminders to one another to fast and pray and engage in religious acts to remain hopeful and to avoid despair. And again, as we saw, many of the chroniclers are looking at this under the lens of the ayah about changing what's in oneself in order to have a better outcome in the environment. And so people are encouraging one another to remove sinful acts from their lives, to focus on good, in hopes that God relieves them of the calamity that has come upon them. And then, so looking at now, as we've seen a bit of the historical context of how the individuals dealt with their situation, we'll look a bit more at the scripture that influences the types of reactions, the types of ways that people are coping with their situation. So two more pieces of scripture that play an important role in this comes from one general and one specific hadith narration of the Prophet. The first of which, recorded in Sahih Muslim, says, "How wondrous is the affair of the believer! Verily, all of his affairs have good in it. And that is not so for anyone but the believer. If he receives prosperity, he shows gratitude, and that is good for him. If he is afflicted by adversity, he shows patience, and that is good for him." And again, looking back at the reactions that we see from the chroniclers, we see that this is very much their attitude, that they see if they get to live, then they will be grateful to God, and that's good for them. If they become sick and die, then they will show patience and die as a martyr. And then specifically about the plague, Aisha, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, had asked the Prophet about the plague, and he responded, "It is a punishment God sends on whom he wills from his servants, and it is also that God makes it a mercy for the believers, as not one of them stays in his land during a plague, remaining patient, seeking reward from God, knowing that nothing can afflict him except what God has written for him, except that his is the like of the reward of the martyr." And again, the reward of a martyr being a very high station, it means that one will not have to face judgment and gets access to heaven. This came as a great relief to many people, that just by quarantining themselves during a plague and remaining patient and hopeful in God would be a way for them to have to go to heaven, was a sense of great relief for people. So there's two very important principles that we take away from this. There's no absolute determination of how a plague must be interpreted insofar as indicating wrath or mercy from God. Both are possibilities depending on individual circumstances. Again, from that hadith that we just looked at, it could be that God is punishing people for their sins. And so we see historical accounts where both scholars and political figures are encouraging people to cleanse themselves of any sins that they are committing and to focus on acts of worship. And at the same time, they are also reminding people that this could be just a mercy from God, that they are being tested, and because they are remaining patient, they get the reward of a martyr and will go to heaven. And on the other hand, so that is an perspective of outlook on the plague. How do we look at plagues? And then in terms of how one acts, a very important point of religious law is that one must never enter nor flee a plague-stricken land and must take available measures to protect oneself and others from danger. So again, so this is coming from the same hadith, talking about people staying in their place. In another hadith, telling people that if you hear a plague, stay where you are or don't return to where you came from. Because because when people are spreading this, they are bringing the hardship to others. And so by avoiding the hardship that is there, they are worshiping God in a way, because they are accepting God's command, but also recognizing that there are ways that they can influence the outcomes of these events. And this is the balance of hope and fear. They have hope of God's mercy and also fear of God's punishment. So hope meaning that they're going to remain patient, and fear meaning that they're going to avoid sins because they don't want God to have God's wrath. And then another balance of reliance upon God and the independence of their own actions. They ultimately trust that God will protect them if he chooses, or if they get afflicted, it is only because there's good in it. But they're also going to take the means that God gave them to protect themselves, avoiding entering a plague-stricken land or staying in place when they're in a plague-stricken land. And then having both patience with hardship and gratitude for ease. So conclusion. So the importance of these historical responses, again, they're giving us as clinicians and Muslim mental health professionals, they're giving us a way of looking at real examples, right? Not only scripture to look at that we can use to create new responses, but we can see, how did people react when they were faced with a plague in the past? What did they find hope in? What difficulties did they have? And how did they cope with it? Where did they find the meaning that they needed to make? And the importance for religious responses, we're looking at the scriptures that people in the past found their meaning in. What gave them the relief that they needed, the hope that they needed in a time when there was lots of despair? And an excerpt from our paper, above all, it appears that it was the deep capacity of Islam to offer resources for meaning-making in previous plagues that allowed it to play such a great role in ameliorating the psychological impacts of plague. Islamic tradition points out that the exact reason behind an incident, including plague, cannot be defined by humans and is only known to God. Again, this comes as a great contrast for those who were able to find the meaning in Islam, as opposed to those who were not, and they found whatever other reasons to blame the plague on. We see in Europe and that they blamed it on other communities, something that was absent from Muslim lands, that they did not blame other communities, and they were able to find their own answers within their scripture instead of trying to find an external reason to have their meaning made out of. And then quickly, a few limitations and future directions. Establishing the congruence between historical accounts and modern experiences is difficult. As we noted at the beginning, that one of the very important areas where there's a difference is in terms of information. That when people are receiving information in the history, it's coming from a messenger, it's coming from word of mouth, it's coming from a letter or such, not from online news, not from videos and these other things that brings all these frightening images to us directly. But at the same time, in modern times, that means that we can have access to know more specifically about what's going on. We can know to protect ourselves sooner than they did back then. Another thing that is hard to establish is the impact of Islam on modern communities. Now, in many communities, it is still very much so. Islam has a very important impact on the communities, but is it still to the same extent that Islam had back in history during the Mamluk period that we looked at? It is not. We cannot establish that without looking further into how important Islam is in people's lives today. And then once again, this is an incomplete overview of recorded accounts. We try to confine ourselves to the Mamluk period in looking at the specific responses the scholars and chroniclers had during this time. But this is even beyond that, what the vast amount of recorded material we have, there is so much unrecorded material in terms of what people did and said that was not written down, and we don't know why it wasn't written down, how that could change our view of how Muslims throughout history responded to plagues. And I would like to thank you all and invite you to explore the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab's various social pages, as well as our non-for-profit Manistan's websites. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you, and Jazakallah khair, Yusuf. So you haven't seen the end of Yusuf just yet. He's going to be back, I think, in about 40 minutes for another 20 minutes or 40 minutes for another presentation. In the meantime, we'd like to bring on our next speaker. Yusuf, if you just quit your screen share if possible. Thank you.
Good. Good. Okay. All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Madiha Tahseen. I'm from the FYI, the Family and Youth Institute. I'll be presenting on essentially pornography consumption among Muslim Americans. My co-presenter is Amar Sain. He will not be joining here today, but he has worked with us on this research. This research was...
I'm going to actually click on the screen and then
there we go. Okay, cool. This research was made possible by the generous donation and support of the Zakat Foundation. So I just wanted to make sure I gave them, due credit, alhamdulillah, for supporting this work. So why did we take on this work? Why did we think this was important to do? I'm not going to go through all the findings. I know I only have 20 minutes, so I want to make sure I get to the good stuff. But basically, we know pornography consumption is on the rise, right? It's happening at earlier ages, and it's happening both intentionally, where you seek it out, but it's also happening unintentionally. So like you can see on the screen, 1 in 4 Muslim youth, 1 in 4 American youth, were exposed unintentionally, right? So that's really very scary, that it could be unintentional, but then it opens these doors for all these dangers, right? We don't really have much research on what these numbers look like in the Muslim community. So Nasiha did this, groundbreaking kind of preliminary look at it in 2018. And they found in their survey of about, I believe it was 350, around 300 youth, they found that 92% of males reported consuming pornography, and 74% of females reported consuming pornography. So those are big numbers, right? This is something that's prevalent in our community, but we need a lot more research. And so Nasiha actually presented at MMH here during that time. We connected with them after that to really collaborate on this project. One, to understand the research, but also create some resources. So today, I'm presenting this to you as a researcher. I am not a clinician by any means. I'm really just talking to you about the numbers and then showing some resources, inshallah. So if they are engaging and consuming pornography, why does it matter? What impact does it have? As you guys can see on the screen, again, I'm not going to go through every single one in the interest of time, but we know it has really negative influences, right? Pornography usually has negative attitudes towards women and negative behaviors towards women. So that fosters those same behaviors in people's interactions in terms of expressing anger and violence in relationships. Youth who watch more and consume pornography tend to have stronger gender stereotypical beliefs. They have an earlier interest in having sex. They display more aggressive behaviors. They have relationship struggles with parents and friends. They're also more associated with, more poor mental health, lower life quality. So just all these negative behaviors that it really puts them at risk for. And with such limited information, it was really important for us to figure out that what does this look like in Muslim youth? We don't know. What is it showing us? At least just a preliminary look. And then why FYI, right? Why did we decide to kind of take this on? After talking to Nasiha and seeing the overwhelming number of calls that they get to their hotline, we realized, one, it's one of our focus areas. So we are a nonprofit research and education organization. Our goal is really to conduct the research and then translate it into resources that serve Muslim youth and families. We don't shy away from taboo and stigmatized topics. And after talking to Nasiha, as I mentioned, this is really a very stigmatized struggle that people cannot figure out where do they need to turn to. And that's why they're calling these hotlines. These youth are struggling and we have to support them. So that's kind of why we took on this project. Just to show you all why I keep talking about resources and why it was important for me to mention that I'm a researcher, this is kind of FYI's theory of change. This is how we get to our final resources that you all see. It's really, really important for us to be very community centered. We're just a voice for the community. So through our workshops, through our dissemination strategies, we're very on the ground and understand the voice of the community. And that's really what we do in kind of step one of identifying the issue, right? What is the community saying? What's this experience look like? So for each project we take on, we make sure that we have listening sessions with stakeholders in the community, with community members that are experiencing themselves. And I'll talk about how we did that for this project. And so I'll walk you through this as I show you the research, inshallah. So the first 3 steps is really what I'm going to focus on today, which is identifying the issues, the research, and then how did we translate some of it to some solutions. The first part of identifying the issue, like I said, is being involved with the community. So for this specific project, we conducted a needs assessment, which had 3 components: the research, experts, and the youth. So with research, we conducted empirical review of the research. I'm not going to present on all 3 components. I'm really just going to focus on the survey today, but I wanted you to know what goes into the project and the findings that you guys see. We're also involved in the community in terms of interviewing the experts. So we made sure we did qualitative interviews with mental health professionals, with community leaders, imams who have youth coming to them with these problems, and just other organizers in the community that are seeing this. And so we wanted to really talk to them and say, what are you seeing? What's helpful? What's not helpful? And then the last part was a survey that was disseminated to the community. So that piece is what I'm going to focus on today, but I wanted you guys to have the big picture. So this survey, Young Muslims is an organization. How many of you have heard of Young Muslims? A few of you. So Young Muslims is a national organization serving youth across the country. They have they have a sisters branch and then the men's branch, both of the logos that you see on the screen. They disseminated a survey because they had been getting a lot of feedback that their youth, which are both high schoolers and college students, are really struggling with this problem and wanted resources. So they launched this survey during the pandemic, so 2020 to 2021. And then when they got the data, they reached out to the FY to analyze the survey and also provide them with some resources. So the survey is not ours. We did not really have control over the findings, the items and the questions that went into it, but we did analyze the data and wanted to present that here today, inshallah. So who made up the survey? Their target population is generally, as I said, high school aged and young adult, which is college aged youth across the country. So they had about 350 American Muslim youth respond to the survey. They were primarily males, but they had a decent portion of females compared to other surveys. It's usually the opposite. Usually women respond to surveys more. Their respondents were primarily South Asian. So that's a big caveat I want to make sure everybody recognizes is these findings are only generalizable to immigrant origin, South Asian youth. They do not generalize to anybody else. So I really want us to be careful with that. And also their sample is generally more religiously practicing, right? So that's who they're going to attract to their organizations. That's who is going to be completing the survey. So just another thing to keep in mind. So what did we kind of analyze from their study, right? We wanted to answer some of these research questions. What's the prevalence? What does it look like in the sample? How do those who watch pornography differ from those who don't? For those who do watch, right? Why do they watch? What impact does it have on them? What are their sources of support that they think they have? And then we dug into it a little bit more with how do frequent viewers differ from less frequent viewers? And I'll explain all of this, but just so you have the big picture, those are the kinds of questions we were looking to answer. So let me get to the findings. So in general, prevalence, right? This is just, the survey asked a question, do you consume pornography? And consume is a very key word here. There's a very big difference between consuming pornography versus being addicted, right? So we're not talking about addiction. This is consumption. This is just people who respond saying they consume pornography at whatever level. So 59% responded saying that they do view pornography. This number is a little lower than what Nasiha found, right? And again, it's not a representative sample, but that's still a big number, right? This is a lot of youth who are viewing pornography. In terms of the gender breakdown, I'll show you a chart in a second, but I wanted to give you one finding first. So of that 59%, the ones who say they do report viewing pornography, majority were men. So 83% were men and 17% were women, okay? So overwhelmingly, it's men who are saying they're consuming pornography. What's interesting, though, is when you break down the total number of women in the survey, right? So that's that chart on the left side, the blue and the red chart. So there's 105 women in the survey overall. This is not 105 women who said they viewed pornography. This is just overall. Of those, though, a third said that they consumed pornography. So a third of the women that took the survey. So this is important because if we always compare women's experiences to men's for this topic, it's always going to look like, oh, women aren't really doing this. This is more men, right? This is a man's issue. This is not a woman's issue. But if you just look at within women, that's still a pretty decent number of women who are engaging in this. So it helps to break down that stereotype a little bit or that misconception a little bit that only men watch pornography and this is not a woman's issue, when that's not really the case, right? We also, how frequently do they watch? So we took some of the responses to understand that. As you guys can see, most of the respondents, said that they were watching. It was kind of split between weekly and daily on one side, some monthly and less than monthly on the other side. What you see in blue is males and the red are females. Of course, you see that females aren't really consuming it as frequently as males are. At what age were respondents exposed? So the majority were exposed between 11 to 14 years old. That's very young, right? So when we think about like intervention points, right, we got to think about earlier. And then I wanted to show just some quick, I know I'm going quick. I'll get slides at the end. I just want to make sure. Okay, I'll do it really quickly. I just want to be respectful of the time. It's a lot. I was trying to think of like, what am I not going to present? But I'm like, it's all interesting. It's all relevant. So I'll try. These are just some quotes that we had from the survey. So I'm going to read through one of them in the interest of time, but I really wanted you guys to hear the voices of Muslim youth and what they were saying and what they wanted to share in the survey. So I'll read the bigger one, which is, whenever I'm done masturbating, I feel terrible. It's the lowest my emotions go. But when you have the thought of it, it feels amazing. I realize after Shaitan is the one that wants me to do this to ruin my spirituality and well-being. And then really quickly, the last point, because I'll have a finding about that too, which is religiosity has no guarantee for prevention, right? I know Hufaz, MSA leaders who are all porn addicts, and some of their marriages fell apart because of it. Okay, and we'll talk about religiosity in a little bit. So that was kind of just looking at everybody that said they consumed pornography, right? Sorry, I know this is heavy stuff, but we got to talk about it. People need help. The next step, what I did is we looked at kind of comparing, remember that frequency table I showed you of how frequently are people consuming pornography? I took that data and I said, okay, let's split you into frequent viewers and sporadic viewers, right? So we couldn't really, I really wanted to be able to, I really wanted to be able to say, like, how do I really differentiate people who view pornography versus those who don't, right? Because that's important. But the survey items were not set up that way, so I couldn't run those analyses. So I said, okay, let's just dig into those who are really frequent viewers and what separates them from those who are sporadic viewers. So what you see on the chart is kind of my breakdown, just to show you how people fell into which category. So, you know, if there are 336 people overall that responded to the survey after I cleaned out any messy data, you have those who viewed pornography, those who don't view, and then you have the breakdown at the very bottom of frequent viewers and sporadic viewers. And what you'll know is most of the women are where? They're in the sporadic viewers, right? So more of the men fall into the frequent viewers category. So then my next step was to compare these two groups, frequent viewers and sporadic viewers. How do they differ on their motivations for viewing pornography, the impact it has, religiosity, the support that they think they're getting from people? How do they kind of differ on those things? So could we use that to think about intervention and prevention efforts? So what you'll see here, it's a lot, I'll break it down. This is their motivations for viewing pornography, right? We used one-way ANOVAs, which is a statistical technique just to compare group means and say, do you belong in this group more than you belong in this group, and do you differ? So what we found is the blue chart, the blue bar graph is sporadic viewers, and the orange is frequent viewers. And so we compared them on these 4 motivations that you see at the bottom, and I'll walk through each of them. We found that frequent viewers, as you guys can see on the chart, scored higher on all these motivations for viewing pornography than sporadic viewers. So frequent viewers were more motivated to watch, to forget the worries of daily life. So that's that chart on the very left side. They felt like consuming pornography helped them feel less lonely. They turned to it to process their negative emotions. And they also used it to soothe themselves when they felt bored or restless. Okay, so this is pandemic times. We know boredom was a big deal. So you can see that that's one of these 4 motivations are really what's separating frequent viewers from sporadic viewers. Okay. The next question we wanted to kind of answer is, what about like trying to quit, right? How do the two groups kind of differ in terms of trying to quit? We found that frequent viewers, again, the orange chart, right? They had tried to stop more than sporadic viewers, but they didn't know how. And then the next chart, the next bar graph says, when the opportunity arises to view pornography, I can avoid it. So one caveat I wanted to make, the first chart, which says I've tried to stop, right? Again, the nature of how we created the groups, frequent versus sporadic, like, of course, frequent viewers are watching more, right? So they're obviously can't stop, right? That's the nature of how we made the group. So that finding, I wouldn't really interpret it, but I just wanted to show you how the means differ a little bit. But the finding right here, the one that says when the opportunity arises to view pornography, I can avoid it. That's really interesting. So sporadic viewers are able to avoid the temptation a little bit better than frequent viewers. So why? What's going on there, right? And is that something that we can think about in terms of intervention efforts? And then the impact, right? What is the impact that viewing or consuming pornography is having on their lives? As you can see, frequent viewers scored higher on all the levels of impact. So I feel like my use of pornography is taking me in a direction I don't want to go. My use of pornography distracts me from accomplishing important tasks. I have organized my routine to ensure I can view pornography. So it's really having an impact on the frequent viewers' lives more so than sporadic viewers in these ways. right? Which kind of makes sense. It aligns with the fact that they are frequent viewers. And then the next thing that we kind of did, so I know I'm throwing a lot of stats at you, but we'll discuss it, inshallah, as soon as I'm done with this slide with some recommendations. What we did then is, can you predict somebody that's going to become a frequent viewer? That's the question we really wanted to answer with this limited survey that we had, right? So we conducted logistic regressions. Logistic regressions are just a way, again, to say you have these two groups. Can you figure out, based on these other variables, will they belong as a frequent viewer or as a sporadic viewer? And so very simplistically, I put the findings on there. If you're more interested in the stats, definitely check with me, inshallah, and I can talk more about that. But basically what this is saying is, what are the odds of being a frequent viewer? Okay, so that first error that you see where it says 68%, what that is basically saying is an increase in the need to soothe yourself when you're bored increases the odds of being a frequent viewer by 63%. So having a greater need to soothe yourself when you're bored increases your chances of watching more pornography and being in that frequent viewer group by 63%. That's a big deal. So that really shows that that's a really big driving factor for consuming a lot of, pornography. Okay, so as you can see, the other odds are there. I'm not going to go through them all, but I think the big thing here is really that what really separates people who consume pornography a lot versus very little is being able to cope and being able to process their emotions and being able to find activities that have to do with being engaged and not bored. So how do we take all this and turn it into recommendations and to serve the community, right? First, the biggest thing is, one of the consistent findings that I just talked about is being able to cope with boredom, right? Of course, this was during pandemic, so this finding is a little stronger than it would be if this wasn't during a pandemic, right? But we need to have engaging activities for youth in our communities. We need to find healthy stimulation for them through appropriate and engaging activities. This is where our communities and parents can really play a role, right? Goal-directed behavior is one of the most strongest predictors for healthy outcomes and protection from engaging in risky behaviors. So if we can provide that for youth, that's one way that we can reduce the odds of becoming a frequent viewer, like we talked about. The next big recommendation is coping skills, right? So a consistent finding, as I said, was being unable or finding difficulty to cope with life stressors and processing negative emotions, right? Muslim youth who experience those needs a lot turned to pornography as a coping mechanism, which can become really maladaptive because you might just start off as a negative coping mechanism, but it can, and just as consumption, but then it can really open the door for what? Addiction, right? And then all the negative consequences tied to that. So it's really important to provide them with coping skills. FYI, as an example, we have a lecture for youth called Real Talk. So you bring us out to your community, we work with the youth to provide them some of those coping skills. But that, just as an example, that's something that communities can be doing a lot. I wanted to be able to go into these quotes, but I can't. What I really want to just show here is in terms of support. So there were questions in there about like religiosity, and also, do you think the Muslim community supports you? Do you think your parents supports you? What's really interesting is Muslim youth, whether they were frequent viewers or sporadic viewers, all across the board felt like the Muslim community was not supporting them in this struggle. They felt like they could not turn to their parents for help across the board. Right? So again, that's a really key relationship when it comes to parents and it comes to the community as a support that we need to build for Muslim youth. I'm not going to be able to go into this, but basically the idea is let's have supportive conversations. Both frequent viewers and sporadic viewers felt the same amount of shame and guilt after consuming pornography. They didn't differ. So all these youth are feeling shame. It's not like frequent viewers like, yeah, it's cool, I'm fine with it, right? I don't care. No, they are equally religious. They equally experience shame and guilt. The difference is frequent viewers just don't know how to stop. They need more coping skills. They need more training. So instead of having conversations with youth that are shaming their behavior and shaming them as an individual, we need to have more supportive conversations. We need to have more supportive contexts. And finally, the last thing is really, there was no question in the survey about sexual education, but actually a lot of the comments talked about sexual education and said, just teach us about it. So we don't have to go and search, and then that opens the door for pornography. Just teach us about it. And there are great organizations doing this work. Heart is one of them. You can bring them out to your community as well. The FYI also has a lot of additional resources that communities themselves, right? So if we can get communities motivated to share these resources with their communities, with their youth, then they can really help youth gain those coping skills that we're talking about, right? And those adaptive, healthy strategies. So there's on there like a therapy guide, there's a digital parenting toolkit, which is like, how do you as a parent navigate the internet and protect your child? There's coming of age workshops, lots of different things there. And I promise, officially the last thing was we took these resources, we partnered with Nasiha, we took these findings, sorry, we partnered with Nasiha to create a toolkit. This is a quote actually from the survey, which was really powerful to me, which is do something about the information you get. This is the main struggle for so many of us in our lives. Do something, right? And so we did. We created this toolkit. I wanted to be able to show you the toolkit, but I don't think I'm going to be able to with time. If you go to the fyi.org, there's this toolkit, again, as a disclaimer, is specifically focused on addiction. But it's targeted in 3 different ways. So you can go to the section of the toolkit that's for those of you who are struggling yourself with pornography. Then there's a section of the toolkit for parents. And then there's a section for if you need to support your spouse that's struggling with it. Or if you just think, hey, I think my spouse might be, what can I do? So, Jazakallah khair. I'm sorry I was rushing it through.
So our like volunteer boss told us to be like merciless with time, and if like the speaker goes over, we just like cut them off, cut the mic. But I couldn't do that with you because what you're talking about is so relevant, and I want to hear you out. If I get in trouble with my boss, it's on me. I think the world needs to hear this, and I wish we could go on. I definitely want to hit this topic more in the discussion, but of course, Yusif has very, very valuable things to say. Yusif, could you screen share and perfect. All right, my man, this looks really interesting. You have 20 minutes to speak. I'll give you like a 5-minute, 2-minute, 1-minute heads up, and then we'll move on to the discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Thank you, everybody, for welcoming me once again, this time not under official Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab position, but as on a personal interest piece that I wrote actually right before I wrote this paper, the original paper I wrote right before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, right in the fall of 2019. And it was because I wrote this, the title here of the original paper is a suhba of solitude. The word suhba in Arabic means companionship. It's something that we see come up a lot in the discussion of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We hear lots of stories about his sahaba, about his companions. And the reason why I wrote this paper initially, at the time I was still an undergrad student, and there was an edition of our student journal on companionship that was coming out. And again, I went to Zaytuna College, a Muslim, a small Muslim college, accredited college here in Berkeley, California. And something that I realized that people didn't want to talk a lot about, but something that I knew personally, that was something that I had struggled and dealt with, and something that I knew from personal conversations with other students at the college, was that loneliness and isolation, these feelings were very prevalent amongst the Muslim youth, meaning youth, and then also up to the college age, that people are feeling very lonely. And we might think that at a place where a Muslim college, a small college, only about 50 students, everybody is very much like-minded, you might not expect that isolation, loneliness, that these things are struggles, especially with spiritual support from imams and teachers and such, but it very much was an issue. And so I began reading into this. And then now, once the pandemic hit, it's kind of exploded into so much more questions about answering this question of how loneliness is dealt with from an Islamic viewpoint. So first, we're going to talk about very generally the loneliness epidemic. Now that we've all become much more familiar with the terms epidemic, pandemic, endemic, all these different terms, we're going to talk about the loneliness epidemic, which was getting a lot more attention before the pandemic took over, but is now, we're starting to see that it is becoming a big question again. So this is one of the main one of the main reports that came out that Harris poll did on behalf of the American Osteopathic Association in 2016, where they found that 3 out of 10 adults reported a weekly sense of loneliness. Okay, so this is just adults across the board, everybody 18 and up. And then 7 out of 10 adults reported a general sense of loneliness. That generally their lives, they would describe it as lonely. And then 3 out of 10 are saying that weekly they are feeling specifically like they are alone and very lonely without any recourse to people to fill that sense of loneliness with. And so some of the reasons why this has taken a hold in our adult population that the American Osteopathic Association found was long working hours, increased use of social media, in many cases surpassing in-person interaction, and a mobile workforce traveling or living far from family. But these are all things that can contribute to these high rates of loneliness amongst adults. Many of the institutions that once created communities, such as schools, churches, and neighborhood organizations, have been replaced by online versions or more solitary activities, adding to modern day loneliness. And so keep this in mind. This is all pre-pandemic issues. So concerns over loneliness. Why is it such a concern if people are feeling lonely? Well, because loneliness is a common factor for people who struggle with substance abuse, clinical depression, cognitive impairment, malnutrition, worse motor function, and hypertension. And in terms of long-term effects, that people who over the course of their life have described these feelings of loneliness, they have a reduction in lifespan similar to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And so we know already all of the health warnings are associated with smoking, and then again also in the second point with obesity, but these are also that the long-term effects of being lonely on a constant basis has the same health effects in terms of shortening one's lifespan as smoking 15 cigarettes a day and being obese. So what is loneliness? Let's define loneliness before we get more into it. Loneliness is defined as distress resulting from a discrepancy between actual and desired social relationships. This is a very key point, is that many people before and now during the pandemic might be around people a lot of the time. This is something that I found with a lot of the students at my college, was that they spend a lot of time around people, but there's a discrepancy between what they're getting out of that relationship with other people and what they're desiring. They're not feeling fulfilled. There's a lack of fulfillment. And so it's not, you can be around others, but you don't have that fulfillment of what you need in a relationship. So the language of loneliness. Now looking at how Islam approaches that, the Islamic tradition, both in terms of scripture and historically, has, because loneliness is a big, very big topic within our Islamic literature. And so we're going to look at how our language impacts the view, that the hermeneutics that we are looking at Islam, we're looking at loneliness through when coming from an Islamic perspective. It's very much influenced by the language. And so the words, so the language of sociability in Arabic, which is the language that we'll see that the scripture and these texts are written in, we see that the word for isolation, wahsh and wuhush, these are words that not only are describing loneliness, but they describe wild things, animals and beasts. So from that root, let me see if I have my, I'm not sure if I have my pointer here so I can show which words I'm talking about. So this is the root word for loneliness and being desolate. And then from that, you also have wahusha, to be abound with wild animals, like a wild place that's just full of lions and hyenas and things like that. And then you have wahsha, loneliness, desolateness, sadness, grief, trouble of mind, fear arising from loneliness or solitude. And then awhasha, to be or become desolate, deserted. So all these words, very negative connotations for this word of being isolated and alone. On the other hand, we see the word ins, nas, and insan. These three words used throughout the Quran, throughout the Hadith, and in the Arabic language to mean human being, man, and mankind. It's very much associated with being intimate and companionable with other people, from the root word anisa, to be sociable, companionable, inclined to company, and uns, sociableness, socialness, intimacy, tranquility, and happiness, and anis, somebody who is a close friend. So this is very important, this dichotomy between in Arabic and through the usage of the Quran and the Hadith of these terms, that there's very much a picture painted of mankind is innately inclined to company with one another, and if you are isolated from others, then you're like a wild animal. You've lost that humanness that you need. So the different words that we'll see in the texts of the scholars regarding aloneness, right? So when we use the word aloneness, it's without any connotation of bad or good. So you have the negative type in terms of negative, meaning negative effects on the body, meaning when we say like things like isolation, alienation, they're bad things, dangerous for your health. And so in Arabic, that's wahsha. And then on the other hand, things that are positive, things that rejuvenate you. You have seclusion, retreat. And so when we're saying aloneness, we're not giving any, not good or bad. When we say loneliness, isolation, alienation, those things are bad. When we say seclusion and retreat, those things are generally good. So the spiritual discourse on loneliness and isolation. So yeah, in the paper, I did a survey of many different texts throughout the Islamic tradition, starting with Abu Abdurrahman as-Sulami, very early on in terms of Islamic literature, Islamic spiritual literature, all the way up to Ahmed ibn Ajiba in Iqad al-Himam, a major text. All of these texts are still very influential until today, taught throughout masajid, in madrasas, in both the East and the West, in Muslim lands and non-Muslim lands, and texts still taught at the college level as well. And all of these texts and many more, it would be impossible to make a complete list of all the places where isolation and loneliness are dealt with from Islamic perspective. But these are all scholars who are very major at their time and in their influence, who wrote very specifically about dealing with loneliness and isolation. So something important that they make is that there is blameworthy and praiseworthy types of isolation. So on the one hand, there is the knowing that when people depart, then you need to be able to, not feel alone, in the sense that it's going to negatively affect you spiritually. It's not going to negatively affect you in your health. You can't just live with that sense of loneliness. And so we see here that Abu Abdurrahman as-Sulami, when he's talking about this sense of loneliness, this condition is treated by the individual knowing that companions depart and that fellowship has separations. It was related from the Prophet ﷺ that the angel Gabriel, peace be upon him, said to him, "Live as you wish, for you are dead. Love whomever you wish, for you will depart him. Do whatever you wish, for you are recompensed for it. Know that a Muslim's nobility is his standing in prayer at night, and his strength is being self-sufficient from other than Allah." So in this, looking at it as, we know that when people leave, people will come and leave, and that in the end, the one thing that is remaining constant that these scholars are reminding is that one's relationship with God is not changing. So this is going to be a very common theme of when one is feeling lonely, reminding oneself that that loneliness is coming from deficiency in a relationship from other people. And so it might be because of expectations we have. We want people to be with us. We want people to support us. We want people to love us. That all of these expectations we have, or maybe it's just that people be with us, but the reality is people can't be with us as much as we want them to be. People have their own lives to tend to. So all these things to deal with, but all of those things can be fulfilled from looking at one's relationship with God. Because God is there, and of course it's not in the same way, people still need the relationship with other people, but recognizing people will have deficiencies, but God is there to answer one's calls when they need it, and finding where can they find that fulfillment that they need with the relationship with God. Can they build that connection? Because God is not physically there for one to see, how does one able to create a relationship with God that fulfills oneself? Abu Qasim al-Hakim said, "All friendship is enmity unless it is sincere. Accumulating wealth is grief unless it is shared. Company causes confusion unless it treats an affliction." So again, having purposeful friendships and companions, because otherwise you're just going to become disappointed. And then the framing of isolation. Complete isolation is blameworthy. Spiritual presence is aimed. Should one prefer to isolate himself, he should believe that through his isolation from creation, the people will be safe from his harms. So again, not focus, the scholars are going to very much aim at this in a sense of not becoming a victim, that you don't see it as, if you want to be away from people, if you feel like you need a break from people, then you don't say it's because people are always letting you down, because these are the kinds of thoughts that psychologically build up harm for people. That if you say to yourself that whenever I make a new friend, they just end up disappointing me, then you start to have a self-fulfilling prophecy that every time that you build a friendship, you are looking for ways that it's going to fail. So the scholars are very much aiming it not towards that sense, but in the sense of, if you're trying to take a break from being with people, or if you're isolated from people, then see it as, you know, it's a time for you to look at what's going on inside yourself, right? You're not trying to save yourself from other people. You're not like, everybody's going to betray me, but let me look at myself and see what's going on. What kind of self-care for my mind, body, and importantly for my soul do I need to do, so that when I am with people, I'm having that fulfilling relationship? So Imam al-Ghazali, again, another very important and foundational author in this field, when he talks about social interactions, he breaks it down into 3 different types. The type of interaction that's like nourishment, one cannot exist without it. So perhaps that's one's family, maybe one's spouse and friends, that if these people were not there in that person's life, they would just feel extremely empty without them. They need to have some type of interaction, right? None of the scholars are going to say that one can just completely let go of everything just at the snap of a finger. And then there's that's like medicine. One needs it from time to time. So perhaps it's somebody who gives you that spiritual uplifting that you need every now and then. Maybe it's a friend that, you know, you are only able to see every now and then, but when you see them, it can take you out of a bad mood. And then there's people that are like an illness. It is never needed, but still they may come. And Imam al-Ghazali says about this, that when people have that, and so we can look at this, that this can actually be a main cause of that feeling of loneliness, is that your interactions in a social group might be hindered by a particular person that you just have an issue with, that whenever you're around that person, it's never healthy for your mind, body, or soul. But you still have to deal with them. Perhaps it's a coworker or a boss at work. Perhaps it's somebody at school that you have to deal with. So Imam al-Ghazali says that in these cases, that you don't focus on trying to make the most out of the relationship, because you know that there isn't, for in some cases, maybe just somebody is just bad for your health, but instead you focus on how to deal with them with patience and to show all of the prophetic qualities so that God can be happy with you. And again, turning away from what people are doing to you and turning to what you can get out, what God can give you in a situation. And then from the benefits of social interaction that the scholars mention, we see fulfilling the human need for social engagement, enjoying the rectifying company of the righteous, realizing blameworthy traits to avoid from others, opportunities to perform communal obligations and pious acts, and protection from harms of inner dialogue and demonic whispering. These are all things that they mention. So even they say, even if you're around people that that are bad and maybe that have bad character traits, that you are getting an opportunity to realize what things you should improve on, and what things, if you don't like the way somebody is talking, then you realize, hey, do I ever talk like that? And then importantly, the scholars mention this inner dialogue, that where somebody starts to have these ideas, and because they're not with others, they become self-destructive to themselves. They're self-sabotaging because they're not interacting with one another. At the same time, there are harms of social interaction that legitimize a need for isolation from others. For example, if one is only being distracted from the remembrance of God, being occupied with worldly affairs, being influenced by bad traits of others, opportunities to commit vices of the tongue and heart, and enduring psychological harm from others. And so because of these harms, at times isolation is beneficial, opportunities to grow this connection to God, fewer distractions from devotion to God, time and space for introspection and reflection, analyze your public and private acts, and being free from temptations and vices that only come with social interaction. But as we've discussed, harms of isolation, you can't bring good to other people, can't perform good communal acts, not having others to check one another if they have faults, the psychological need for interaction not being fulfilled, and one may be susceptible to that inner dialogue and demonic whispering. Okay, let's see. Okay, and then quickly before my time is up, I want to specifically note this one piece from Ibn Ata'illah al-Iskandari, من أوحشك من خلقه فاعلم أنه يريد أن يفتح لك باب الأنس به. When he, meaning God, isolates you from his creation, then know he wants to open to you the door of intimacy with him. And then in commenting on this, Ibn Ajiba says, this is the way of God, the sunnah of Allah, literally, exalted with his creation. If he wishes to bring his servant to intimacy by giving him remembrance of God, and to be affectionate with him by giving him experiential knowledge of God, then he isolates that servant from his creation in preoccupations. So when he isolates you from his creation, and when he secludes you from them in your heart, right? So specifically being secluded in your heart, not necessarily physically, maybe people are still around you, but you're not feeling fulfilled, then know that it's because God exalted wants to make you close to him and enrich you with gnosis. And so this is the state in which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ received his prophecy. And then let me skip ahead here before my time ends. And so, yeah, so in the paper, we're looking at the ways that both from modern clinical psychology dealing with physical and communal isolation. So whether one is physically isolated from others and needs to find a connection to God, or whether one is with others, but is trying to find a way to be connected with God, and trying to create sort of a roadmap for people to go through and establish an idea of how one can find that connection. And then finally, the question to ask is, how does this all apply with an epidemic within an epidemic? Now that we're in the age of the coronavirus, many things are, now we're starting to emerge from it, but looking at how we are able to adapt into this new world of new types of social interactions, where a lot of the pre-2020 connections that we had might have been disrupted or completely broken. How do we build up that again? And thank you.
All right, that was really thought-provoking, and I look forward to going through these presentations again myself later. So we're kind of short for time, so technically the panel ends now, but we have a couple minutes left for just a brief discussion. And Yusif, you presented twice, both times incredibly poignant, incredibly meaningful. I noticed this connection between your first presentation and Sanah's presentation, and ties back to this conversation I was having last night. And the point of these conferences is that you bring people together from different backgrounds. We bounce ideas off of each other. We spar, we contend, and we hear different perspectives. And this girl was Catholic, so she's not Muslim. She decided to come here on a whim. Her friend was taking the red eye to Yale, and she was like, what the heck, I'm going to come with. And she came with him, and she doesn't have much exposure to Muslims, but she wanted to learn. So, and she's a therapist, and she follows the existential psychotherapy tradition. So we're talking about Viktor Frankl here, right? Viktor Frankl. And what we were talking about Islamic psychology, and I said the closest thing to Islamic psychology is the existential psychotherapy tradition. So Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, finding meaning in life. So that's like height psychology versus Jungian Freudian depth psychology. And just this notion that, what Islamic psychology says, what we understand from the Deen, our luminaries in Islamic psychology, Dr. Rothman, Dr. Badri, Dr. Rania Awad herself, they talk about this, and it reflects back to Frankl. So it's this idea that meaning is intrinsic to life, right? So like height psychology versus depth psychology is that you're not thinking about the past, you're thinking about the present, you're thinking about the future, you're thinking about the fact that, Yuval Harari said in Sapiens that the only consistent theme throughout humanity is suffering, right? So suffering is consistent, it's been there, it always will be there. And the way to get through suffering is to like find meaning in life, right? That's logotherapy. And this idea that there's like this North Star, right? There's a North Star up there, and you're like bumbling and stumbling towards that North Star. And you kind of like define meaning for your life, for yourself in life. And logotherapy is that everyone's meaning is different. So for a Syrian refugee, like getting through their struggle is like unique to their situation. They're going to find meaning, right? Whether you're in the bubonic plague, right? Today's pandemic, whether you're losing loved ones like in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, in Damascus, in the US or in Canada, right? this struggle is like ubiquitous, and the need to find meaning in that struggle is ubiquitous. And that's how like Western secular, like, you talk, I think Sanah talked about Maslow, right? So actually, so she talked about how Ibn Sina supplants Maslow. So like Abraham Maslow, like the father of like humanistic psychology, kind of delineated this like hierarchy of needs, right? And I've studied this as well. Ibn Sina kind of came up with the hierarchy of needs like 900 years before Maslow came up with it. And it's this idea that we need like meaning in our life. We have to like strive towards something in order to make life worth living. And it's this theme that runs consistent. And, I was telling this girl last night that this need to find meaning in life is the central thread that ties the fabric of civilization together. It's something that comes up over and over and over again. Socrates talks about it in the Apology. Frankl talks about it. Abraham Maslow talks about it. Ibn Sina talks about it, and it's deep in our religious tradition as well, and it's something to think about. It's 3:33 Yale time. We don't really have time for questions because we're starting our next panel in 12 minutes, but if anyone has anything that they just really need to say, we can probably entertain like 1 or 2 questions, but it's going to have to be quick. So if anyone has anything from our online audience, put it in the chat. First come, first serve. We're going to take 2 questions. Whoever has anything to say. How about our live audience?
I have a question for that.
Go for it. So does anyone have anything in the live chat?
They can go first.
I don't see anything so far. So Noreen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't you come up here and like say it into the mic, because otherwise, or you can tell me, it's up to you.
Okay. Well, my question is,
Yeah.
when you all measured, like, what was the basis of pornography? Like, was it actual porn? Was it TVs that have nudity? What was like, this is because we have shows, especially the youth now, watching shows like Euphoria that are soft porn, essentially. And then was the measurement of porn coherent to masturbation, or was it just viewing? Right. This is an excellent.
So could you like kind of answer this? I don't want to like leave our online audience out here. Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Sure. Yeah. So the question was, and just tell me if I did this justice, but it's like, what was the nature of the pornography alluded to in the presentation? So was it like visual? Was it like hard pornography on the internet? Was it like the kind of soft porn that we find like in like TV and movies and popular culture these days? So what was the definition? Was it like a definitional question?
Yeah, it's like definition of pornography. Yeah. And are you accounting for material that is public?
Yeah. Okay. So, and I would add like another layer of sophistication to that and say, was it like explicitly like visual pornography, or was it like auditory, or just like reading, like erotica work, because like that should like come into that definition as well. So yeah, go ahead.
It's a great, excellent question. If you don't have a background in research, let's talk. That's a great research question.
I am a researcher, so that is why I'm asking.
Okay, I'll be very quick. So one, again, we got this survey given to us, right? So we didn't have control over the items. The way that they asked the items was essentially they asked the youth themselves to define pornography. So they responded to certain items, which are the usual that you said, right? Like visual material, graphic material, whether it's watching TV that has explicit content, whether it's actual like hard pornography. So they had all those options, and then youth could also provide their own options as well. So when I cleaned the data, I made sure that I did not include any participants that were talking about that had what doesn't really count as pornography. So there were some youth who, they said, oh, I watch shows and maybe kissing will show up. So you could tell from their responses that they really were not talking about like pornography, whether soft or hard. They were really just talking about, they said it in their responses to like bad sin to watch, bad, like just kissing or stuff like that. So I made sure to clean out the data from that perspective. The way that they asked a question about pornography, unfortunately, was they did not define it in the question itself. So they literally just said, do you consume pornography? But before that, they had asked questions about how do the youth themselves define pornography. So by association, I cleaned out data that wasn't looking at like hard or soft pornography, but the way that the youth were responding, you could see that they were thinking about all forms of it. So there were definitely youth who talked about literature, and just reading material. There were youth who definitely talked about literally what you're saying about shows, which is like soft pornography. And then there were youth in there that were like actually hard addicts, right? But I can't talk about the data as addiction because of the nature of the questions, if that helps.
All right.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna have to wrap up because we're
Sorry.
starting a session soon. All right, guys, it was a pleasure having all of you here. I'm sorry we're gonna have to cut this short because we're starting another session in 8 minutes. You guys are amazing. I hope to stay in touch with all of you. Yeah, some of you more. Yeah, all of you. So yeah, I'm gonna cut this session. I hope to see all of you in 8 minutes for our next panel. Okay, assalamu alaikum and jazakallah khair.